In this presentation, I want to offer some thoughts on the topic of religion and development in the Middle East that I personally have observed and engaged with during my years of working closely on issues of contemporary religion in the region over the last 15 years. For that reason, I try my hand at offering an academic overview of an aspect of religious discourse and development interwoven with the consideration of the policy dimension. My hope is that it will have resonance for practitioners and researchers and academics working on the topic. So I will split my presentation into three sections. First, I will briefly recap the state of the development literature on the topic of religion and use this as a frame to introduce my argument. Second, I will proceed to presenting two case studies to exemplify how religious scholars and institutions approach existing development issues. Both case studies generally support what I call the patchwork approach to religion and development, though they also demonstrate some subtle nuances. And in the third section, I will bring attention to a different approach to the religion and development question, and it's a conceptual approach, and I believe it's more consequential and more substantive than the patchwork approach. And it is a priority for religious leaders, even though it may not enjoy the attention that the patchwork approach enjoys. So, with respect to the existing literature, the recognition of religion in the practical development field has come a long way since the World Bank's pioneering Faith Unit initiative in the late 1990s. In the last decade or so, a number of development agencies have produced guidelines on engaging faith based organizations, all in recognition of the prominent role such organizations play in delivering development services. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are aware of these, um, but I think it might be worth just touching on them for the purpose of this presentation. And there are two guidelines in particular that I want to bring attention to for the purpose and context of my discussion. So first, the British government's then Department for International Development, published the Faith Partnership Principles document in 2011. Though short, it was a substantial enough document to recognize not only the delivery of services by faith-based organizations, but also the centrality of religion to people and societies around the world. The three main principles in the document are worthy of note. First is the principle of transparency, in which faith groups and the department accept and acknowledge the need to be open about their mission, beliefs, values, policies, and practices. Second, the principle of mutual recognition, which is that they need to mutually recognize the roles, contributions, and added values of faith groups and development agencies in development. And the third principle highlighted by this guideline was that of understanding, that is, the role that faith groups play and in development and the contributions that they make to development. The first two principles clearly relate to instrumental concerns. The third principle is general, but it leaves open the possibility for a consideration of religion that extends beyond the instrumental concern. This is certainly the case when we consider the key areas the principles are to be applied to. The document itself says that these principles are to apply to building a common understanding of faith and development, documenting the impact of faith groups, and working on difficult and contested issues on which views, opinions, and values may diverge. Now, this is an important recognition by the document, and I shall explain why in the preceding parts of my presentation. A second set of guidelines for engagement with religion was issued by the United Nations Development Programme entitled the UNDP Guidelines on Engaging with Faith-Based Organizations and Religious Leaders. So these guidelines were significant because they were the outcome of an extensive consultation procedure that included various UN agencies, not least the UN's Interagency Task Force on Engaging Faith-Based Organizations for Development, and civil society partners and faith-based organization partners around the world. Though the focus is towards the improvement of service delivery through FBOs, there is mention in these guidelines of the need to know local religious contexts. As vague and abstract as that statement is, it does bring attention nonetheless to the possibility of wider horizons informing the religion and development issue. So taken together, these two policy documents in particular demonstrate two things. First, they show that policy, perhaps inevitably, is overly concerned with the notion of religious instrumentalization. That is, how does a force like religion, which is prevalent in the development hotspots of the world, be engaged in the delivery of development services? Second, the guidelines also recognize to a degree the potential tension that exists between religion and development. Namely, that religion and development policy and religion and conceptions of development may not always be aligned. That is to say, religious traditions could have their own conceptions of what constitutes development. As intuitive as this point is, I believe its significance is understated and it's under-recognized, despite it constituting the essential and foundational priority for some religious leaders. To elaborate on how this is done and why this is the case, why the conceptual approach is the case, I will present two case studies to first demonstrate how some religious scholars engage the instrumental approach, that is, they engage themselves in the delivery of predetermined development services. I think to bring attention to this matter is important for policy purposes, but also for the academic study of religion and development. So as Jones and Peterson in the 2011 article suggest, the instrumental view of religion is dominant, in this view, religion is valued only to the extent that it facilitates the delivery of predetermined development services. But the question of how religious resources envision and define development does not yet enjoy a comparable interest in the literature, and it's hoped in the course of this presentation that I can bring attention to this aspect of the literature. So moving to the case studies, the first case study that I like to focus on involves my own organization, the Tabah Foundation, and a partnership that we had with the UN refugees, with the UN Refugee Agency. So in 2013, the UNHCR has a private sector partnership team based in the MENA region. And they identified Islamic philanthropy as a potential source of fundraising for the growing refugee problem in the region and beyond. The potential they identified in Islamic philanthropy made sense because it aligned with the fact that around 59% of forcibly displaced persons in the world belong to the Islamic faith. Through its own Muslim employees, the UNHCR was able to recognize that Muslims are required to pay an obligatory annual alms tax in service of the poor and needy known as zakat. Zakat, short, is a payment an adult makes on any wealth left in their possession after accounting for necessary expenses. Zakat is stipulated at 2.5% of that excess wealth, and when taking into account that there are close to 2 billion Muslims in the world, the potential of zakat remains enormous. The challenge, however, UNHCR faced was the fact that zakat is a religious payment, a religious tax, subjected to sophisticated, intricate details in Islamic moral law, which the UNHCR does not have the remit nor the expertise to engage in. Second, the second challenge they faced was the fact that zakat is a religious obligation of Muslims, to become involved in its distribution would necessarily require the UNHCR to implicate itself in religious involvement. So, in other words, the UNHCR case at this point demonstrated the futility of clearly demarcating lines between the secular and the sacred that we often hear about and come across, whether in literature or in policy circles themselves. So, through its own contacts in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, the UNHCR reached out to Tabah Foundation, and specifically the founder of the foundation, to present their proposal, this idea of harnessing zakat to address the refugee problem. Essentially, the UNHCR wanted to distribute zakat payments amongst Muslim refugees, but they needed to know if this was morally permitted by Islamic law and whether it could be religiously sanctioned by recognized Islamic authorities. The situation itself was quite significant. A global, non-religious, culturally secular institution was seeking religious authorization to execute the charity that is accumulated out of a devotional act. In 2016, Tabah Foundation agreed to collaborate the UNHCR on two fronts. First, Tabah would liaise on behalf of UNHCR with recognized Islamic authorities in the world to attain a fatwa, an ethical legal verdict that would give the UNHCR religious eligibility to collect zakat funds and distribute them. On that note, Tabah liaised with senior religious authorities and institutions in Egypt, Yemen, Morocco, and the UAE, presenting these authorities with a detailed profile of the issue at hand and gaining in return detailed religious edicts on how the UNHCR could collect and distribute zakat in a way that would fulfill Islam's ethical and moral criteria. By the last quarter of 2016, a pilot project was launched in Jordan and then later extended to Syrian refugees in Lebanon and internally displaced persons in Yemen. The zakat program was then officially launched in 2018, and Tabah Foundation proposed to continue to monitor the program to ensure Sharia compliance, to which the UNHCR willingly committed. By 2019, $14.4 million was raised through the program and for distribution amongst refugees. So, for the purposes of this presentation, I have raised this case study for two reasons. First, it shows that even in the context of development service delivery, engagement with religious organizations can encounter complexities that exist far beyond the capacity of the faith-based organization to deliver the intended services, and which show the inadequacy of bringing oversimplified notions of religion into the field. Second, this case study shows that where intentions, purposes, and ends meet, that is, intentions, purposes, and ends between development agencies and religious organizations meet, they can and they should collaborate, even if that means that development agencies have to get involved in the conceptual, normative, and thought side of religion. Now, my second case study is less thorough, but it has received some, it's more historical, it's less thorough, but it has received some attention in the literature. And I think it's important to mention it because it contrasts with the Tabah case study and it further exemplifies the complexities and nuances of religious and development engagement. So the second case study refers to the UN International Conference on Population and Development in Egypt in 1994. In 1994 in Cairo, the UN held a week-long international conference on population and development. In the UN's view, this conference articulated a bold vision for the future of the world's population and articulated a shift in global thinking on development and population issues. Given that the conference took place in Cairo, the home of one of the oldest and most authoritative Islamic learning institutions in the world, the Al-Azhar, and given the fact that the conference took on delicate and sensitive moral and ethical issues such as gender equality, the family unit, reproductive rights, is there's no coincidence between there being some debate and discussion on those issues. So a key outcome of the conference, as recorded in the document adopted by its participants, was the recognition that women play an essential role in the program of population control, but to fulfill that role, they must gain complete control over their reproduction. On this point, there was a concern raised by some Muslim participants, and it was related to the implications of such a statement. As is often the case with meta-level development goals and narratives, they can often encroach into moral and ethical issues and thus have normative significance. Being inattentive to this reality under the guise of commitment to neutral values may hold in certain parts of the world, but not all, and this poses a dilemma for development initiatives. The scholars of Al-Azhar were particularly attentive to the normative, ethical, and moral issues that were being discussed, and for that reason, they became involved in some of the debates and discussions that took place, and this resulted in Egypt issuing a disclaimer in relation to its implementation of the proceedings of the conference. And this disclaimer effectively recognized that many of the issues that were being discussed had a moral and ethical dimension to them, and therefore they would have to be subject to normative analysis. In other words, the Egyptian position was rejecting the notion that issues of normative, moral, and ethical significance can be settled with abstract, universalizable statements and settled on morally neutral grounds. The Grand Imam of Al-Azhar at that time, Jad al-Haq, was outspoken in his opposition to the suggestion that abortion be readily available, though he did support measures for the availability of contraception. Nonetheless, his stance resonated with representatives of the Vatican and other religious communities who were in attendance, and this opened the door for what will ever be an issue in any engagement between religion and development, that there are many development issues that are morally, ethically, and normatively significant and which do not lend themselves easily to being settled by so-called universal or morally neutral principles. The conference, it seems, recognized this dilemma, and therefore the conference agreed to include within its final document the clause that the implementation of the program should reflect the various religious and cultural values of the signatory countries. As welcome as this may be to non-Western countries, it still skips around and avoids the so-called elephant in the room, the fact that on morally salient issues there can be insurmountable disagreement, and a development policy in that context will have to be malleable enough to compromise until some type of agreement, moral and ethical agreement, can be reached. Hence, in contrast to the Tabah case, where the development goals of the agency complied with the moral values, purpose, and duties of the religious institution, and which had a strong humanitarian and thus universalist appeal, in the case of the Cairo conference, we have a development goal which is reproduction rights that was morally loaded and which could not enjoy a universal conception. So both cases show that the utility framework of development, using religious institutions for the delivery of development services, can only work on a limited number of universally agreed upon moral issues. Now, this takes me to the second part of my presentation, which is to show that religious scholars are not always acting in response to the requests of development agencies, and then trying to find ways to conceptualize the issue at hand from within a traditional religious framework. That is, they're not taking an existing development issue and trying to find justifications for it from within religion in order to give credence to its delivery in their context or their cities or their towns or countries. Religious scholars are also engaged in another approach to development, and this is a deeper conceptual work that they are engaged in. And they view this as underpinning any development effort, because development is related to service delivery in an empirical sense, but it also is born out of ideas that are prevalent and extant in any milieu that surrounds the agent responsible for drafting development goals. So when these agents are not local to a context, and more so when they are foreigners who share little in terms of the ethical, moral, and spiritual frameworks that prevail in any locality, the potential and certainty of conflict, that's conceptual conflict, is inevitable. For that reason, some of the same scholars who have operated and engaged with the instrumental approach to development and religion, and have proactively engaged with development agencies, have also worked on what they see as the more substantive and demanding task of defining development and providing a conception of development that is indigenous to their moral, ethical, and spiritual worldviews. They envisage that such an endeavor can lead to a development agenda that is true to its locality and uninhibited by the religious sensitivities that predominantly secular institutions have. So this conceptual approach to understand the efforts exerted by the scholars engaged in this approach, I will present an overview of what I consider just one aspect, one issue, and that they are currently engaged with. And obviously, because of time, I cannot go into too much detail, but I hope it's enough to give a somewhat of an overview of what they're trying to do. So, in Islamic legal and ethical theory, there's a concept of the al-kulliyat al-khams, or what I may call, or what we shall call, the principal goods. And the principal goods are understood as self-evident universal human goods that religion in general and the Islamic faith in particular hold as the foundation of human welfare and common interest, and they are considered indispensable for individual and collective human life, regardless of the religion or law to which one adheres. These human goods are understood as values and ends that people of any religious persuasion would seek for themselves and their religious community. Islamic legal and ethical theorists enumerate the principal human goods as 5 in total, and they are explained as seeking the promotion and protection of human life, the promotion and protection of human life, human reason, the pursuit of religious faith, human dignity, and human property. These principal goods, these 5 principal goods, have been understood by legal and moral theorists in the Islamic tradition to pertain to all domains of human life. So this includes the moral life, the personal moral life of individual believers, where the principal goods serve as moral values that ought to be embedded in behavior. So they guide behavior, or they ought to guide behavior. They are also pertinent in the formulation of legislation as principles of legal reasoning, and they are also relevant at the level of the state because they act as ends or objectives that a state ought to uphold. And for development purposes, the five principal goods constitute the goods that a development program should endeavor to provide, whether in part or in full. So, on a closer view of these human goods, we may begin to notice why scholars have sought to engage in a theoretical and normative treatment of the development question. So if we take, for example, the first principal good of the preservation of life, what we understand, sorry, before that point, let me just mention that actually I'll skip to this bit just because of time. So if we take the first principal good of human life, this is considered a principal good for the most obvious reason that life must be encouraged and protected in order for all the other goods to be attained. So at the level of the state, a commitment to the primary good of life can be fulfilled through enacting policies that mitigate risks to life. And these would encompass security and health risks, and also policies that seek to cultivate the social conditions that are conducive to the longevity of life. And one can imagine the breadth of spheres this would touch on. In some respects, this principal good could serve as the preeminent and primary purpose of an Islamic notion of development. And this, what I've just mentioned, is contained within contemporary works of Islamic moral and legal theory, in which everything that I've just mentioned is discussed by the theorists. Similarly, the same theorists, when they discuss the good of human reason, they consider it to be premised on the understanding that reason or the human intellect is the locus of moral responsibility in a person, and any diminishment of his capacity inhibits a person from undertaking life actions and decisions with consciousness and awareness, and thereby undermining the primary good of life itself. Because if a person cannot undertake a decision with a sane state of mind, then life itself is undermined. And so then these scholars and theorists consider this principle as being concerned with the cognitive health of people, especially in a time when we're becoming more acutely aware of the danger of disinformation, for example, and algorithmic techniques to influence human thoughts and decisions. With respect to the pursuit of religious faith, according to the previous Mufti of Egypt, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, the good of the pursuit of religion enjoins upon a state the duty to secure the legal and moral rights for individuals and communities to pursue and practice their chosen faith tradition, and it provides a moral basis for the acceptance of religious diversity in a society. So we could note here that the pursuit of religion then is not necessarily to be equated with the proselytization of religion. While it's easy to confuse them with each other, and this often happens in policy circles, the principal good of religion is more concerned with preserving the presence and existence of a faith-centered life in society, where the society has chosen that as a way of life, as opposed to coercing people into a particular faith. With respect to the fourth principal good of human dignity, this is conceptualized as encompassing a number of subgoods, including the protection of human dignity and respect that is possessed by peoples by virtue of being humans. And also, it's understood that human dignity encompasses the primacy of the institution of the family. And on the final principal good, which of human property, this has been discussed as assigning an inviolable protection to the wealth, property, and belongings of a person, such that they should enjoy freedom from interference of the state or other parties on the ground, because a person is naturally entitled to enjoy their own wealth and possessions without external interference. So this is how, very briefly, this is how these five principal goods have been discussed in some contemporary works. And these human goods, they are understood as values and ends that any community would seek to, realize. But they've also, what we also notice with respect to them is that they can form a basis upon which a conception of development can be built. So, for example, if we compare these human goods or these principal goods to the capabilities approach elaborated by Amartya Sen, we can see that there's a difference in focus on what should constitute an essential good for human beings. Now, if one could argue that these human goods, these principal goods, are more abstract, they're more encompassing, and they're more holistic, because they are not only concerned with the material means by which human life can be improved, but they also consider, other dimensions of the human experience. And this would not be a wrong diagnosis of understanding how these goods have been conceptualized by contemporary scholars. And this holistic dimension or consideration of the human being is something that is continuously brought attention to in their writings. The last point that I'd like to make on this, with respect to my presentation, or actually to bring it to a conclusion, is that the concept of development, just as any political concept, is rooted in prior assumptions about the human being. So when such a concept gives rise to development policies that promote and privilege some aspects of the human experience over others, we have to acknowledge that a normative and non-neutral decision is being taken on what is important in life, what is right, and what is good. Now, if we begin from this recognition, then it brings into question the universalizability of a conception of development, and whether a conception of development rooted in a secular liberal paradigm, for example, can really be applied all around the world equally. Now, the topic of religion in contemporary political theory has reignited debates around the universalizability of secular liberal paradigms and whether there are alternatives that can be harnessed or not. And this is, I think, a burgeoning and important field of research that has yet to be given adequate attention. My second point that I'd like to conclude with is that one may say that we understand religious scholars can engage critically and constructively with development agencies. One may also say that we get the point about returning to first principles and Islamic scholars attempting to build up a notion of Islamic development from, the Islamic tradition. But so what? Why is that so important to recognize? In short, I would say to such a question that the reason it's important to consider an Islamic conception of development and the type of work that is taking place among some scholars. I think it's important because the endeavor of Islamic scholars to rethink development is essentially a call to recognize plurality at the level of thought and worldviews. So it's a call to recognize that one notion, one conception, one policy approach, one view of what development is insufficient in dealing with the vast array of development problems and challenges that exist in different parts of the world. from another perspective, it's a challenge to the liberal worldview's ambition. That is liberalism about liberalizing the field, or is liberalism about pluralizing the input into the field, such that it can tolerate various inputs into the, what development actually is? And I think it's important to have these conversations, sorry, because we're living in a moment that recognizes the inevitability of thought pluralism more now than at any moment in the last 30 years. So I'll finish on that note, and I apologize for going over.
Thank you very, very much, Abbas. I think we can cut 5 minutes into the lunch break. So the floor is open for questions now. And I'll start with Jennifer, unless that's in previous hand. Go ahead,
No,
Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. That's a current one. Thanks, Eckart, and thank you so much, Abbas. My question is for you. I used to work for Islamic Relief, and they obviously also collect zakah. And we were actually really interested in what international secular agencies, such as the UN agencies that you mentioned, do in the area of zakah collection and distribution. One key thing that we were struggling with at Islamic Relief, and one of the reasons why to this date they don't have a public zakah policy, is intra-Islamic disagreements. So between Shia and Sunni, and within Sunni Islam between the different madhabs. And then obviously Islamic Relief, similar to these UN agencies, is also an agency that works across the world in lots of different contexts. Yeah, they were really struggling with that. And I mean, now I have someone here who seems to have worked on this. So I take the opportunity and ask you, how on earth did you manage to bridge this gap and balance these different priorities?
Well, I mean, that's it's a wide-ranging question, but in short, it really begins with how we understand difference. So there are some primary differences amongst the two main religious sects in Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. And given that Tabah Foundation primarily belongs to the Sunni tradition and engages more with Sunni religious traditions, we made no attempt to try and provide a Shia-sourced opinion, though we did recommend that may be something that could be looked into by the UNHCR. But we focused only on Sunni institutions. Now the thing with now differences in intra-Sunni differences, how we understand them is very important. Now, from a scholarly perspective, for example, in major religious institutions, and even within religious traditions of knowledge and legal and moral thought, differences are not considered insurmountable, and differences are not considered to be so deep that they can prevent certain types of activity from proceeding. So while there are legitimate differences and interpretations on any type of moral or ethical issue, rather than seeing them as rather than looking at them as denoting truth or non-truth, they are looked upon as providing a spectrum of permissible views. So when in traditional Sunni Islam, you have four traditional main schools of Islamic legal and moral thought, and they will differ on many things. But this difference is considered a natural occurrence out of a legal process, just as in any legal tradition or moral tradition, you have different views and conceptions of many different issues. This is the same case within the traditional Sunni schools. But what's important is that the scholars and the specialists and experts, muftis and scholars who engage in Islamic legal and moral thought, they look upon these as providing a spectrum of views that are acceptable, especially in the realm of public policy. And that's why there are principles that exist, for example, in Islamic notions of policy and politics, that it's, one can take any opinion that can exist, which is legitimately differed upon. Any one opinion, even if it's disagreed upon by other schools of thought, it can be taken as a public policy. And this is actually the case in many Muslim countries. If one actually looks closely at some of the public policies that they have, some of them are based upon minority opinions that exist within Islamic law. But that's because religious institutions understand that this is a permissible approach to public policy. So essentially, the way that we understood differences, especially amongst the traditional Sunni schools, is not that this is a problem, but rather it's an opportunity, because again, like I said, it provides a wide range of possible options and routes and solutions to the problem at hand. And in the documents that we produced, and in the fatwas that were given, they're all available online. You can see how Islamic scholars and religious institutions reasoned over this issue. And so all of that's actually available online.
Thank you. Can we continue with Dr. Buthaina? Please unmute yourself if you could still hear us.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام.
شكرا جزيلا على العرض، كان رائع. أعتقد أنه حضرتك ركزت على الدولة السنية لأن هي ما تملك مرجع ديني، ولا أعتقد أنه الأزهر يمثلهم جميعا. هاي يعني أول نقطة أحب أطرحها. كذلك مسألة الزكاة إذا نريد نطبقها بالدول الإسلامية تحتاج إلى قانون، وإذا ما طالبت بهذا القانون سأدمج الدين بالسياسة، وهذا ضد التوجه العالمي من طرح كثير من المصطلحات، من الإسلام الفوبيا، من الإسلام السياسي وغيرها، راح يدخلني بكثير من المشاكل. كثير من الجمعيات موجودة بالعراق تعتمد على الزكاة وعلى العمل الإسلامي، منها العتبات العباسية والحسينية، منها حسب علمي كمنظمات مجتمع مدني، منها مثلا مؤسسة عين للرعاية الاجتماعية اللي تقدم كفالة أيتام لآلاف من الأيتام. فهل ما أعرف عدم ذكرك لهذه الفئة حتى لو تأخذها كعينة في بحث ثاني برأيي يكون كلش مناسب. الزكاة بالإسلام هو ركن أساسي من الأركان، لكن تعرف أنه يجب أن يوزع إلى عينات مختارة ذكرت بالقرآن الكريم. هل برأيك أنه المسلمين لهم ثقة بقياداتهم السياسية بتوزيع أموال الزكاة لهذه الفئات حتى يتم طرحها؟ هل إن الطرح، آخر سؤال، هل إن طرحي للمسائل الدينية من زكاة وغيرها راح يكون انتقائي لما أطرحها حسب أهداف التنمية المستدامة؟ هل أخذ الدين وأدخله ضمن الأهداف التنمية المستدامة، أو يكون طرح جماهيري بهذه هذا الطرح الواسع، أم إنه راح يصير ضدي تيار جماهيري؟ نعم، يعني أتمنى أنه الفكرة وصلت. شكرا جزيلا.
Okay, obviously there's a number of questions there. I'll try and provide a couple of points on them. With respect to the the issue of zakat and being and implicating religion into the state. I mean, I don't think that's an issue. That if it's religion is part of the state, whether we like it or not, and even in the Western countries, historically, religion hasn't, except in some countries, religion hasn't totally been disassociated from the state. I mean, I'm in the UK right now, which is constitutionally a Christian country. The Queen is the head of the church here. So the head of the state is also the head of the church. Likewise, in many other countries, at least in a practical sense, even in France, which is considered to be of a very secular nature, the state is not completely disassociated from being implicated in some religious issues. For example, some of the churches that are existent there and some of the arrangements that they have with the state. But that's in a practical sense. Even in a theoretical sense, there's some very interesting debates in contemporary political theory about the extent to which a state can be involved in religion, and whether we need to have a clean break, or whether even a clean break is absolutely possible, and whether historically it's been possible as well. So on the question of religion and the state, I try not to take this. I try not to take a black and white approach to it, because I think the issue is much more complex than that. And I think it's inevitable for a state to be, especially in a religious society, to be involved in religious issues. For example, on marriage, marriage issues, death issues, birth issues. The state is involved to a large extent in these issues, and the basis of those issues exists in religious law and religious, moral, and ethical law. So on that point. On the other point of this may answer a few questions, but why the UN and why not other Islamic institutions? We also recognize that over the last few decades, that there's been no shortage of exploitation of religion for political purposes, and zakat and humanitarian endeavors being one aspect of the religious issue that's been exploited for whatever purposes certain groups or movements have. The reason that we were interested in working with the UNHCR is because it's it's an international institution, and it does not have any type of affiliation with any particular religious group. And by virtue of being part of the UN, it can work with a host of states, regardless of who they are and regardless of what they're perpetrating or what they're not doing. And it can work with a host of states, and therefore it can reach a large amount of people. And we felt that it was important, given that they expressed their interest first in this issue, they expressed an interest in seeking some type of solution to this issue. We felt that it was important to work with them.
Thank you.
And I think given the time, I probably should stop there, but I'd be happy to follow it up at another place.